The river in spring was a cruel and beautiful thing. Swollen with snowmelt, it moved like something remembering pain, wide-hipped and wild with hunger. Trees leaned in close to listen, their new leaves trembling like secrets. The banks, still soft from thaw, wept into the water. It was the season of drowning. She didn't cry out when she hit the current. Her body struck the river like a stone with no name, dragged instantly into the whirl of cold. Her arms didn't flail. There was no scream, no last defiant gasp for the sky. Just the shudder of skirts ballooning, the soft glug of breath leaving her mouth. She went under with the hush of someone who'd already said goodbye. He didn't see her fall, but he saw the dress. At first, he thought it was a dead cow caught in the bend. Pale cloth, limp and unmoored. Then it twisted in the current, and he caught the shape of it, the fragile human outline beneath layers of wet cotton and silence. Something in him moved faster than thought. He dropped the reins. The horse skittered, confused. He was down the bank in 2 strides, boots slamming mud, hat gone. The water welcomed him with a knife's kiss, icy, brutal, sharp enough to drive air from his lungs. But he reached her. Hands found fabric, then flesh. She wasn't fighting. Her hair fanned like black river weed, skin gray-blue as ash. He hauled her up through rage and root, arms burning, lungs screaming. The shore felt miles away. His boots lost one heel, his coat tore at the sleeve. But the river gave her up, grudgingly. She spilled onto the bank like something reborn and ruined. She didn't breathe. He laid her down, turned her gently. Water gushed from her mouth. He pressed her chest. Again. A cough. Then another. She vomited water and mud, curled like a child, shivering with no sound. He wrapped her in his coat. Not out of gallantry, just instinct. She didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed on the river. He sat back on his heels, soaking and spent. The cold gnawed at his bones, but he couldn't look away from her. She wasn't young, not anymore. Maybe 30. Not old either. Her hands looked worked to the bone, not delicate, not soft. And her face, it held something he didn't know how to name. Not fear. Not grief. Just a stillness that didn't belong on someone alive. His horse had wandered back up the trail. The cart stood where he'd left it, simple, worn, loaded with salt pork and beans for the ranch. This trip was supposed to be routine. 3 days there, 3 back. That morning, he'd thought only of the road and his silence. Now, she was here. And nothing felt routine. He didn't speak as he helped her up. She stumbled once, then followed without a word. Her bare feet bled on the gravel. He lifted her onto the wagon without asking and climbed in beside her. The cabin wasn't far. An old trapper's hut, half-rotted, roof patched in places with tin and prayer. He'd planned to rest there overnight, let the horse drink, warm by a fire. Now it held something different, a second life. Inside, he lit a flame from dry bark and pine pitch. The light flickered like a frightened thing. She sat by it, still silent, arms wrapped tight. The coat hung from her like it belonged to a ghost. He brought a blanket, laid it over her shoulders. Still, no words. He wanted to ask, who threw you in? Who were you running from? Why didn't you fight? But he didn't. Instead, he moved with quiet purpose. Took off his wet boots, poured water into a tin pot, stirred beans over the fire. When he passed her the bowl, her hands trembled so hard some spilled. She ate anyway. Outside, the river roared softly beneath the dark. A fox barked once in the brush. Somewhere in the trees, an owl asked a question no one would answer. The man didn't sleep much that night. He lay on the floor with his rifle close, more habit than fear. She slept by the fire, curled like a leaf, her breath shallow. Once, in the middle dark, she whispered something. He couldn't make it out, but her lips moved like prayer. Morning came with pale gold and frost-laced air. The fire had died. She hadn't run. He stirred coals and made coffee, strong enough to wake the dead. She drank it slow, still watching him like someone learning the shape of a stranger. Her eyes were dark and steady, not trusting, just awake. "You got a name?" he asked, not gently, not cruelly. She hesitated, then said, "Hallie." He nodded once. "I'm Jonah." No handshake. No other words. He hitched the horse. They could ride out, reach the next town by dusk. Leave the river behind. He didn't ask if she wanted to come. He just helped her up again and turned the cart toward the road. It wasn't until the sun cleared the pines that she finally spoke more than a word. "I didn't fall." He said nothing. "I didn't slip," she added. "He meant for me to go under." Jonah's hands tightened on the reins. The leather creaked. "Who?" Her gaze stayed fixed on the trees. "Doesn't matter now." Jonah didn't press, but his jaw set hard. The trail narrowed, winding through cottonwoods. Birdsong dared the stillness. Jonah noticed the way Hallie's fingers curled around the edge of the bench, as if bracing herself against memory. Her dress, still damp at the hem, smelled of river rot and pine. They passed a marker carved into a tree, 3 slashes and a notch. "Indian sign," some said. Jonah just knew it meant travelers had come this way and not all of them stayed. He glanced at Hallie. Her expression hadn't changed. He remembered a different spring. 3 years back. His wife had bled out trying to birth their daughter. Both were buried on the ridge where the grass grew in silver tufts. That spring had drowned him too, just in a slower way. Maybe that's why he jumped in the river yesterday without thinking. He'd already known what drowning felt like. This time, maybe he was ready to pull someone else from it. They made camp near an abandoned corral as dusk fell. Jonah started a fire. Hallie gathered wood without being asked. Her silence wasn't the kind that pushed people away. It was the kind that held things close. He watched her rub warmth into her hands. She had a scar on her forearm, long and pale, the kind made by rope or rage. She caught him staring, then looked away. "I wasn't always quiet," she said softly. "But noise never saved me." Jonah offered a strip of jerky. She took it. Later, as the stars came out, she sang under her breath. No words. Just sound, something between a lullaby and mourning. Jonah didn't interrupt. They sat like that for a long time, the fire crackling between them, both staring at flames and things they couldn't name. The wind moved gently through the grass. Somewhere behind them, the river kept on rushing, never once looking back. He didn't know what she was running from. He didn't know what she carried in her bones. But she'd chosen not to drown, even if she hadn't meant to. And he, who once had no more use for company or cause, now found himself watching over her as if it meant something. As if pulling her from the river had pulled him, too. When she finally looked at him, something passed between them. Not romance. Not yet. Just a flicker of shared survival. She said, "Thank you." And it wasn't gratitude. It was recognition. A soft kind of seeing. He gave a slow nod. The firelight caught the edge of his worn face. Neither of them smiled. But neither looked away. Somewhere in the hills, a storm gathered. The air held the smell of coming rain. The next road would not be easy. But they were no longer traveling alone. The morning after the second fire, the wind changed. Jonah noticed it in the shift of the grass, the way the smoke from the cookpot curled east instead of west. Hallie noticed it in the way the crows kept their distance, as if they sensed something too heavy to perch near. They hadn't spoken much since the river. Words came in soft, scattered threads, not silence exactly, just a quiet agreement not to press too deep. But something unspoken moved between them, not affection, not yet, but the beginnings of recognition. A man who had stopped looking for anything, and a woman who'd stopped believing anyone would look for her at all. They traveled 2 more days before the wheel cracked on a rock and left them stranded at the edge of a creek-fed clearing. The cabin they found then was older than memory, slouched against a rise in the land, its timbers silvered with time and nailed through with stubbornness. Jonah knew of it, an old trapper station, half abandoned but dry enough for shelter. Inside, the air smelled of dust and pine sap. A broken chair lay in the corner. A rusted stove crouched in the shadows. It would do. Jonah set about fixing the axle. Hallie gathered wood without being told. That night, she lit the fire herself. He watched her. Her hands were quick, careful. This was not a woman unused to tending hearths. But she moved like someone bracing against every sudden noise, every footstep. Like she'd once had to read the air before it turned against her. Jonah didn't ask what had happened at the river. Not again. But the question hung between them, silent as the stars pressing against the roof. He didn't need details to know someone had wanted her gone. They stayed there for 2 nights, waiting out the mending. Jonah worked by day, shirt sleeves rolled, sweat carving lines through the dust. Hallie kept near, not hovering, not hiding. Just there. Present in a way that asked nothing, but offered something steady. She didn't try to win him with talk or charm. She cleaned the pan before he could. She refolded the blanket with military precision. She found a wild onion patch and brought back a handful, as if to say, I won't take more than I give. That evening, a knock came. Not a knock, really, a shuffle, a brush of feet. Jonah stepped to the door with his rifle. But it was just a trapper passing through, an old Metis man named Jude, with a wife who looked more bone than breath. They were headed north for winter fur work. Jonah offered coffee. Jude accepted. The woman, her name was Annie, sat beside Hallie and said nothing for a long while. Then, in a language neither Jonah nor Hallie spoke, she murmured a few words. Hallie didn't answer, only looked at her with wide, steady eyes. Annie nodded, as if she'd heard enough. Later, as the moon rose and the couple disappeared back into the dark, Hallie finally spoke what Jonah had suspected since the river. I was married, she said, voice low. Not by choice. My father owed land. The man who took me was older. Cruel in ways that never bruised. Not at first. Jonah didn't speak. He wanted a son. I never gave him one. Her hand touched the base of her throat, almost absent-mindedly, like checking for a pulse. When spring came, she continued, he said I'd outlived my use. Took me to the river. Told me to confess, then pushed. The fire cracked. I didn't scream, she said. I think part of me was ready. Jonah stirred the embers, slow and deliberate. He's a settler, she added. One who shakes hands with the law and hides the bruises with charm. She looked at him then. Not to see if he pitied her, to see if he feared her. If knowing who she was would change what he saw. But Jonah only said, You swim better than most. It wasn't a joke. Not really. But it was something. It made the air less sharp. The next morning, he found her humming while sweeping the porch with a bundle of pine needles. The song was aimless, almost tuneless. But it was a sound. A piece of her unhidden. Jonah worked quietly nearby, mending tack. He glanced up once to see the sunlight catch her hair, not shining, not glowing, but alive. A living thing rising from river water and silence. When he spoke next, it surprised them both. My wife died 3 springs ago. Child 2. Fever came fast. Left nothing but quiet. Hallie didn't answer. Just stood a little straighter. Thought I was done with saving anything after that, he said. Then you came down river. She stepped onto the porch and sat, hands folded in her lap. I didn't ask you to save me. I know. But I'm glad you did. He nodded once, as if that settled it. They didn't touch. No reaching across space. But something shifted in the way she looked at him after that. Not fondness, not yet, but absence of fear. A shared grief is a strange kind of bond. It makes strangers into witnesses. They left the cabin at dawn. The axle held. The road curved through new territory, greener now. Hills rolled like low prayers. Hallie sat beside him, hair tucked, face set with quiet resolve. Jonah noticed the way she watched the land, not nervously, but attentively, like someone measuring how far they could run if they had to. He wanted to tell her she wouldn't have to run again. But he hadn't earned those words. Not yet. They stopped near a stream to water the horse. Hallie knelt to fill a canteen and stared at the reflection staring back. Not a ghost, not anymore. Just a woman worn thin by survival. Her eyes met her own, and for a flicker, she didn't look away. Jonah came up behind her with a wrapped biscuit. She accepted it. Ate slow. "They'll come looking," she said after a while. "Who?" "His friends. My father's men. Someone always comes." Jonah stared out at the trees, then said, "Let him come." He didn't say it with bravado, just a simple certainty. Hallie didn't argue. She just closed her eyes and listened to the stream. When they reached the next town, he rented a room above the blacksmith's. One bed, clean enough. He offered to sleep on the floor. She didn't object. But that night, she folded his coat and laid it near his pillow. It wasn't affection. It was acknowledgement. A gesture that said, "I see what you've given, and I'll carry it right." They stayed there for 2 days. Bought supplies. Fixed the wheel properly. Hallie found a dress in the general store that didn't cling to her like shame. It was gray, plain, stitched well. She wore it with a scarf wrapped high, hair braided back. When Jonah saw her, he didn't speak. But he looked. And Hallie felt the look settle somewhere deep. Not ownership, not lust. Just witness. That night, while thunder cracked low on the horizon and the scent of sage drifted through the window, Hallie asked the question that had been waiting between them since the river. "Why did you save me?" Jonah didn't look away from the storm. "Because I saw you." Her breath caught, just once. "And what do you see now?" "A woman not meant to be quiet forever." She didn't answer. But she turned toward the window and let the wind brush her face. Outside, the rain began in earnest. It was the kind of rain that meant spring was serious now, the kind that carved new rivers and woke the buried things. And neither of them, watching the sky split open, knew yet what it would bring. But both of them stayed by the window until the glass fogged and the room grew still. For the first time in her memory, Hallie didn't feel like something left behind. She felt like something beginning. The sun rose late that morning, thick behind gauzy clouds that dulled its warmth and stretched the light across the valley like pale cloth. Jonah stood at the edge of a cedar grove, reading the wind. He had always trusted weather more than men. Weather never lied. And today, the air spoke of change. They had been at the ranch 3 weeks. His land sat quiet along the foothills, bordered by broken fence posts and a barn that leaned like it remembered better days. The place was still half wild, scattered with cottonwoods and old mule trails. It suited him, and now, for reasons he hadn't planned, it suited Hallie too. She moved through the place like someone who didn't expect to stay, but who couldn't help making it better while she lingered. She patched the pantry's torn screens. She cleared the henhouse without complaint. When she saw the wild garden Jonah hadn't touched in 2 years, she planted rows of green shoots with bare hands and a quiet mouth. She still hadn't told him her full name. Jonah didn't push. But he noticed the way she flinched when the post rider came too close, or how she folded each of her blouses in a perfect square, ready to leave at any time. A woman like that lived with 1 foot outside the door, no matter how soft the floor was. That day, the letter came. The writer, a boy with a crooked tooth and too many freckles, handed Jonah the sealed note while his horse drank. Jonah opened it on the porch, standing in shadow. It was from Harris, his ranch foreman. Trouble was brewing on the southern border, talk of land disputes, cattle going missing. But it wasn't the loss that tightened Jonah's jaw. It was the name at the bottom of the page. Wade Carson. Hallie was sweeping the back step when he walked around. She paused as soon as she saw his face. "You know the name Carson?" he asked, tone level, careful. Her body stilled. The broom tilted. She looked at him with that dark, steady gaze that always struck him as too calm for a woman her age. "I do," she said after a long moment. "He's the one causing trouble on the border. Claims the land was promised to him. Said he's sending men." Hallie lowered her eyes. "He's my father." Jonah exhaled slowly. The wind rustled the new garden behind her, whispering secrets in green leaves. "I figured," he said. "Or guessed." She looked up, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. "You're not angry? Not sure what good that'd do?" Her fingers tightened around the broom handle. "You should be. He tried to burn your family's land once, didn't he? That was 10 years ago. He came with 10 men and a bottle of whiskey. Left with 2 broken ribs and a new enemy." Hallie swallowed hard. "He gave me to Holt Dunn as a wedding gift. I was 16. Said it would seal a truce." Jonah didn't respond right away. He stared at the trees beyond the barn, his voice low when he finally spoke. "Did it? For a while. Then the truce soured. And I was still married." Her mouth twisted at the memory. "By then, I knew better than to run." Jonah stepped closer, slow as always. "You ran anyway." "I didn't. Not really. I drowned." Something in him flinched at that. He thought of her floating in that swollen river, limp and silent. He hadn't known then what saving her would mean. Only that he couldn't let her vanish. He looked her full in the face now. "You could have told me. I didn't want to be sent away. I wouldn't have. You don't know that. Don't need to." The silence between them lengthened, not uncomfortable, just full. Then Hallie nodded, once, as if giving him something she'd never offered before. "Trust. Not all of it. But a beginning." That evening, she cooked beans with sage and dried apples, the way his mother had. He didn't ask how she knew. She just placed the bowl beside him, sat across the table, and watched the fire curl in the stove like an old dog settling in. "Will you fight him?" she asked quietly. "If he pushes. But I'll try not to. You could lose the ranch. I've lost more than that and kept breathing." Her hand slid across the table, close but not touching. "He doesn't lose easy. Neither do I." A week passed. Then another. They worked side by side, mostly in silence, but not the kind that hurt. He watched her shoulders loosen. She laughed once, a real laugh, when the goat escaped and chased him halfway to the creek. He hadn't known he missed that sound until it came out of her. Still, the storm approached. One night, a rider came hard up the road, his horse lathered. Jonah met him at the edge of the pasture. "Carson's men crossed the south line," the rider said, breath ragged. "3 of 'em. Cut the fence. Took 5 head." Jonah said nothing for a beat. Then, "Did they say anything?" "Said next time, they'd take the barn." Jonah nodded once. "No anger. Just preparation. Tell Harris to double the watch. I'll be down tomorrow." When he returned to the house, Hallie was sitting on the porch in her nightdress, shawl tight around her shoulders. She didn't ask what the rider had said. "He's close," she murmured. "He is." She looked at the sky. "What are you going to do?" "Go south. Show them I'm not afraid. That this land's not up for theft. I should leave." "No. If he sees me." "I said no." She turned toward him, eyes sharp. "This isn't your fight." "I think it is." Silence. Then she whispered, "Why?" "Because you're here. And because no one else ever chose to stand between you and him. Not even you." The words landed like truth between them. She stood, trembling just slightly, but not from fear. From something heavier. From the ache of being believed. "I want to go with you." He hesitated. "It'll be dangerous. I've lived dangerous. Let me live honest." They rode south at dawn, mist curling low along the creeks, birds calling from the brush with voices that sounded like warnings. Hallie rode astride, skirts bundled, face set. Jonah kept his eyes forward, one hand near the rifle, the other on the reins. The land grew thinner as they went, fewer trees, more dust, grass that bent under the weight of drought and age. They reached the disputed line by late morning. Harris was already there, rifle slung, eyes grim. 3 men waiting near the draw, he said. Not hiding. Just standing there like they owned the place. Jonah dismounted. Hallie stayed close. The 3 men stood at the rise, one smoking, the others watching. They wore worn coats and the look of men who'd seen war, but not honor. "Tell your boss this land's not for the taking," Jonah said, voice steady. The smoking man spat. "He says it's his. He's wrong. Maybe. Maybe not. But he's coming. Wants the girl." Hallie stepped forward then. Not behind Jonah. Beside him. "Tell him I'm not property. I'm not a gift. And I'm not afraid." The man blinked, surprised. Then smirked. "We'll see." They rode off. Jonah and Hallie watched them until the dust faded. Harris cleared his throat. "She's got iron in her spine." Jonah nodded. "She's got more than that." They returned to the ranch that night, neither speaking much. But something in them had changed. The fear had been named. The line drawn. A storm moved in the next morning, not of guns or fists, but of wind and rain. The sky cracked open and poured for hours. Hallie stood barefoot in it, face lifted. Jonah watched from the porch. She came in dripping, hair wild. "Do you believe in new beginnings?" she asked softly. "I didn't. Not until you." She stepped closer. "Then let this be one." He didn't touch her. But he stood so close she could feel the heat of him. "I'm not asking you to save me," she whispered. "You're not the one who needs saving now," he replied. And just then, the storm quieted, and the air smelled of sage and rain, and the world felt possible again. The first rose bloomed on a Tuesday. Hallie found it at dawn, unfolding from its thorn stalk like a whispered apology from the earth. Rain had fallen hard the night before, leaving the ground soft beneath her bare feet. She touched the petals with 2 fingers, reverent. They were the color of old blush, not loud or proud, just quietly alive. Jonah watched from the porch, arms crossed, coffee steaming beside him. He'd planted the bush years ago, back when his wife still wore yellow ribbons in her hair. It had stopped blooming the year she died, gone thorn and silent since. That it flowered now felt like something too sacred to speak aloud. Hallie turned, holding his gaze. No smile, just understanding. The garden, once a wild patch of weeds and stubborn roots, had become her rhythm. She worked it every morning, hands in the soil before sunrise, hair braided, skirts hitched at the knees. Jonah had offered gloves once. She declined. "I like feeling it," she'd said. "The dirt reminds me I'm here." The ranch settled around her like a body learning to breathe again. Jonah found himself listening for her footsteps when she wasn't near. She moved lightly, but not timidly. Her presence was felt, in folded laundry, warm biscuits, a book left open by the fire. Nothing loud. Just signs of a life choosing to remain. But the threat of her father lingered like the scent of gunpowder in a cooled barrel. Wade Carson hadn't returned yet. No new riders, no bold demands. But Jonah knew better than to trust silence from a man who dealt in cruelty. Quiet could mean plodding. Or worse, patience. Jonah took to walking the fences every evening. Not out of fear, but readiness. Harris rode out farther, keeping watch with a wary eye. The men respected Hallie now, though they rarely said it aloud. She'd mended shirts, packed lunches, offered salves for burns and scrapes. She spoke little, but what she said mattered. And when she looked at you, it was like being seen without judgment. The ranch was healing. So was she. One night, Jonah caught her humming on the porch, one hand tracing the banister as she looked up at the stars. He stepped beside her, close enough to share breath. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked softly. She didn't answer at first. Then, "Every day." He looked down. "But not because I want to," she added. "Just because it's all I've ever known." Jonah nodded, slow. "Running." She glanced at him. "And you? You ever think about starting over?" "I did once. It nearly broke me." Her voice dropped, nearly lost to the wind. "But you stayed." "I did." They stood there, side by side, the hush between them threaded with something unnamed. Not yet love, but its twin, patient and unafraid. Days passed, slow and golden. Rain came often now, soaking the land into richness. The hills greened. The cattle grew strong. Jonah found laughter coming easier. He hadn't laughed in years without feeling guilt chasing it. One afternoon, Hallie joined the other women in town to help with a birthing. The midwife, a hard-edged woman named Ruth, had asked her personally. "You've got calm hands," she'd said. "That matters more than experience." Hallie came back hours later, bone-tired and blood-spattered, eyes hollow but steady. "Girl lived," she murmured, sitting on the porch steps. "So did the mother. Just barely." Jonah brought her water. She drank deep, then laid her head against the post. "You okay?" he asked. Hallie looked up at him, not fragile, not hard, just real. "No one screamed at me. No one struck me. No one sent me away. I don't think I've ever been this tired or this seen." Jonah knelt before her. "That's what staying feels like." She reached for his hand. He let her take it. That night, he couldn't sleep. The wind howled through the eaves. He thought about the way her fingers had curled around his. Not desperate. Not demanding. Just wanting to know someone would stay if she held on. He got up before dawn and found her already in the garden. She looked up, rain glistening on her cheekbones. "We'll need a fence if the beans come in strong," she said. "I'll build it." A silence passed. "Jonah." "Yeah." "If he comes, if my father rides here again, I won't run." He met her eyes. "You won't have to." The fence was finished by week's end. Hallie painted it white, laughing softly when she got more on her dress than the wood. Jonah watched her from the porch, heart heavier than he expected. Not with dread. With the slow, unexpected ache of hope. He found himself remembering things he'd buried, the feel of a woman's weight beside him in bed, the hush of soft conversation before sleep. He hadn't wanted that again. Not after the loss. But with Hallie, it wasn't the same wanting. It wasn't desperation. It was recognition. One evening, a letter came. This time not from Harris or a ranch hand, but from the sheriff in town. A formal note, sealed tight. Jonah read it twice. His jaw clenched. Hallie approached as he folded the parchment. "Something wrong." "Your father." Her face didn't change. "He sent word. Claims he wants a meeting. Peaceful. In public. He'll come to the church at dusk tomorrow." Hallie's breath caught, barely. "A trap." "Possibly. But he won't try anything there. Not in front of townsfolk. He's too proud." "Will you go?" "I will." "Will you let me?" Jonah's gaze held hers. "Only if you're sure." "I'm sure." The church was a simple wooden building with a bell that hadn't rung in years. Jonah arrived with Hallie beside him, both dressed clean, unarmed. Wade Carson was already there, flanked by two men, hired, not kin. He hadn't aged kindly. His beard was gray and sharp as steel wool. His eyes held no warmth. Hallie stepped forward before Jonah could speak. "I'm not coming with you." Wade laughed. "Wasn't offering, daughter. I just wanted to see the man who thought he could keep what belongs to me." "She doesn't belong to anyone," Jonah said, voice calm. Wade's smile turned thin. "Your land's weak on the south side. Fences don't hold. Men talk. Let them. I'm offering you a trade. Let the girl come back quiet, and I won't take the rest." Hallie stepped closer. "You already took everything once. I came back from it. You won't take anything again." The church fell silent. Wade looked at her like a thing he didn't recognize. "You think you've changed." "I have." He stepped forward. Jonah moved between them. "You touch her," he said, quiet and low, "and I bury you where the fence cuts south." Wade's face twitched. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed. "Look at that. Fire in both of you. Maybe I raised you better than I thought." "You didn't raise me," Hallie said. Wade turned to leave, waving a lazy hand. "Keep her, rancher." She's more trouble than she's worth. Jonah didn't move until the three figures disappeared into the dusk. Hallie stood beside him, not shaking. Not now. They walked home under a quiet sky. No words. Just footfalls and breath. Later, by the hearth, Jonah poured 2 cups of coffee. Hallie wrapped herself in her shawl. "I think he believed you," she said softly. "I didn't say it to convince him." She smiled, tired but genuine. "I know." They sat side by side, shoulders touching. Not lovers yet. Not quite. But something deeper. "You ever think," she whispered, "that some people were born waiting for the right place to bloom?" Jonah looked at her. "I do now." Outside, the rain had begun again, soft and steady on the roof. Inside, nothing broke the silence, not even their breathing. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and for the first time in years, he didn't flinch from closeness. And for the first time in her life, she didn't apologize for taking up space. A full moon rose over the plains like a silver reckoning. The night air, once soft with spring's gentler promise, now carried a sharper edge, like something had shifted underneath the skin of the land. Jonah felt it in his chest, in the way his breath didn't settle and the horses paced their pens with restless eyes. Trouble was coming, not on paper or through whispers this time, but on hooves and boots and anger that wanted its name back. They were eating supper when the first shot cracked through the valley. Not close, not yet, but near enough to raise every hair on Jonah's arms. He stood before the spoon could hit the table. Hallie was already on her feet, her eyes wide but not panicked. She'd stopped panicking weeks ago. Fear had turned to steel in her belly, and now it looked out from behind her quiet composure like something long kept ready. Jonah opened the door and scanned the horizon. Lanterns flickered along the southern fence line. Not their lanterns. "They're here," he said. She didn't ask who. She already knew. Harris came riding hard into the yard, breathless and mud-smeared. 4 men. Guns drawn. Cut the north fence to bait us south. Saw one set fire to the hay barn before I turned back. They're splitting, trying to pull us thin. Jonah nodded. "Where's Wade?" "Didn't see him yet." Hallie stepped forward. "He'll be last. He always sends others to bleed first." Jonah looked at her then, not with worry, but with admiration. "The kind you save for those who've walked through fire barefoot and come out carrying the coals." He wanted to tell her she didn't have to stay and fight. He wanted to offer her a way out. But it would be an insult now. She wasn't something fragile. She was the proof left behind after everything else burned. "Where do you want me?" she asked. Jonah hesitated. "Inside. At the back door. Keep it locked. Rifles loaded. Don't open for anyone but me." She opened her mouth, but he stopped her with a glance. "I need to know you're still breathing when this ends." She nodded once. No arguments. He stepped into the dark, rifle slung, jaw set. Harris followed. They moved fast, circling toward the blaze licking up from the barn. Flames danced against the night sky, casting the land in a kind of hellish twilight. Cattle screamed in the distance. A shot rang out to the west, return fire. Harris veered toward it. Jonah crouched near the fence, heart steady, ears open. 2 shadows approached the blaze, rifles swinging like pendulums. He waited until they stepped fully into the light, then called out, "Leave while your boots are dry. That's your only warning." The men paused. One raised his rifle. Jonah shot first. The man fell backward into flame-lit dirt. The other ran. Jonah didn't chase. He didn't need to. By the time the fire burned down to a smoking hush, the men had scattered. But Wade Carson hadn't shown his face. Not yet. Jonah returned to the house, sweat clinging to his neck, boots thick with ash. Hallie opened the door before he reached it. She didn't ask what had happened. Her eyes scanned his body, quick, trained. No blood. No limp. She exhaled quietly and stepped aside. He walked in, set the rifle down. "He's not here," he said. She nodded. "Then he's waiting." Jonah moved to the basin, washed soot from his hands. When he looked up, she was behind him, watching in the mirror. "Tonight ends it," she said softly. He turned. "I know. I don't want revenge, Jonah. I know. I want to look him in the eye and say no. You will. I want to be free." "You already are." She closed the distance then, hands reaching up to press against his chest, not to cling, but to feel the weight of a man who stood with her instead of above her. He didn't kiss her. Not yet. But his hands settled at her waist like they'd always known the shape of her. The knock came at midnight. 3 slow thuds, spaced like punctuation. Jonah grabbed the rifle. Hallie stood behind him. Another knock. He opened the door. Wade stood in the yard, lantern swinging from one hand, pistol holstered. He looked smaller than Jonah remembered, thinner, older, eyes like nails hammered too deep. "I came alone," Wade said. Jonah didn't move. "Unwise. Maybe. But I figured you'd want to talk before someone died." Hallie stepped into the light then. Wade's jaw twitched. "You always did know how to disappoint," he said. She didn't flinch. "You always did know how to lose." Wade's eyes narrowed. "You think this ends with you planting carrots and bedding down with a man whose kin ruined me? I think it ends with me not fearing your voice anymore. You carry my blood, not my shame." Jonah lifted the rifle a hair. Wade raised both hands, mock surrender. "You think killing me makes you whole?" "I think it makes the rest of my nights quiet," Jonah said. Hallie stepped forward. Her voice was steady, even. "I don't want you dead, Father. I want you forgotten. I want to build a life where your name is nothing more than dust on the window." He stared at her, and something passed through his face. Surprise, maybe. Or recognition. "You were always softer than I hoped," he muttered. "And you were always weaker than you pretended." Silence fell. The kind that asks something of a man. Then Wade dropped the lantern. Let it hit the dirt and sputter out. "I won't be back," he said. "Not because I fear you, but because you're no longer worth reclaiming." He turned, walked into the night. Jonah didn't lower the rifle until the darkness swallowed him. Inside, the house was warm. The fire had died to embers. Hallie sat at the table, hands folded, shoulders slack. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. Jonah poured 2 cups of coffee, set one beside her, sat down. For a while, they drank in silence. Then she said, "I kept waiting for him to strike me." Jonah said nothing, but all he did was speak. That's all men like him ever really had. She looked at him. "You could have shot him." "I would have. If you'd needed me to." "I didn't." "I know." They sat until the first blush of dawn lit the windows. The land outside was damp, still holding the scent of ash and rain. But it was whole. Hallie stood, stretched, went to the door. When she opened it, the breeze caught her braid, lifted it like a banner. She stepped into the yard barefoot. Jonah followed. They walked to the garden. The rosebush still stood, petals slightly wilted but intact. She touched one bloom with care. Then she turned to him. "I want to stay." He didn't smile, just nodded. "You already have." She reached for him then, hand on his cheek, thumb brushing the stubble there. He leaned into her touch like a man learning something new. This time, he kissed her. It wasn't desperate. It wasn't hurried. It was the kind of kiss that closes one door and opens another. Behind them, the ranch stretched out in its crooked, stubborn beauty, scarred, mended, and full of breath. The fire had come, but water had held.
Snow fell like a hush from heaven, soft and unhurried, blanketing the pines with a silence so deep it felt like prayer. Each flake turned the forest into something ancient and sacred, untouched and listening. The wind was quiet that morning, but the cold was sharp enough to sting the bones. Eloise Harper walked ahead of the sled, her boots breaking a slow trail through the drifts. The ropes bit into her palms, rough and fraying, but she bore them without complaint. Behind her, small and steady, Julia walked with her hands tucked into her coat sleeves, her breath fogging up in front of her. She was 10, though she'd stopped acting like it a long time ago. Winters like these aged people quicker, especially children with no one else to lean on. The sled creaked beneath the firewood they'd spent the better part of the morning gathering. Thin sticks, bark-damp logs, anything that would burn and not choke them out with smoke. It wasn't much, but it was enough for one more night. Eloise's face was unreadable in the way of women who've been disappointed too many times to wear expression like jewelry. Her beauty, once commented on with a breathless awe, had thinned into something leaner, stronger. There were lines at the corners of her mouth, not from laughter. Her eyes were the color of creek ice, pale, deep, patient. They crested a low hill, and the forest opened like a mouth below them. To the west, the old ridge trail cut through a line of fir trees, nearly swallowed by snow. They'd gone farther than usual today. The wood near the homestead had grown scarce, and Eloise wasn't the kind to ask favors from neighbors unless something was bleeding. Julia trailed close behind. Her boots were patched, her mittens knitted from mismatched yarn, but she never once complained. She looked up often, watching the sky as if it might change, as if it might offer something besides cold. Then she stopped. "Ma," she said, her voice low but clear. "There's something there." Eloise turned. Julia stood motionless, her eyes locked on a dark shape at the base of a tree about 20 paces ahead. Eloise followed her gaze, and for a moment she saw nothing but snow and shadow. Then it moved, just slightly, a twitch in the whiteness, unnatural. She moved quickly, pulling Julia behind her with a motion that was more instinct than thought. Step by step, she approached the figure, heart tightening like a fist inside her chest. She thought, for a terrible second, that it might be a bear, half dead and waiting. But no, it was a man. He was tied to the tree, with rope half buried beneath fresh snowfall. His head was slumped forward, face ghost pale against the bark. His coat was torn, one arm limp at a wrong angle. Blood, dark and frozen, crusted his temple. Whoever had left him here meant for him not to be found. Eloise crouched beside him, her fingers reaching slowly to his throat. His skin was icy, but there was a pulse, faint, thready, but present. She looked back at Julia. The child's eyes were wide, but not afraid. She'd seen worse. They both had. "We can't leave him," Julia said softly. Eloise didn't answer right away. She stared at the man, his chapped lips, the tremble in his breath, the fine coat beneath the blood and dirt. A rich man once, but none of that mattered now. "Help me cut him loose," she said. Julia pulled the small knife from her boot and handed it to her mother, without a word. Eloise worked through the knots with quick, deliberate movements, jaw tight, breath misting the air between them. The rope was thick, the work slow, and every second felt like it was counted by some cruel clock in the sky. Finally, he slumped forward into her arms. He was heavier than he looked, all lean muscle and soaked wool. Julia brought the sled closer, and together they managed to load him onto it, resting his head against the firewood with a folded blanket beneath it. He didn't stir. "Can we get him home?" Julia asked. Eloise stared down the path they'd taken, narrow, uphill, and frozen stiff. She knew what it would take to haul him back. Her shoulders ached at the thought. But there wasn't another choice. Not for them. "We'll try," she said. And so they did. The journey back was brutal. Eloise took the front of the rope, digging her heels into the snow as she pulled. Julia pushed from behind, leaning her full weight into the sled whenever it caught on a root or ridge of ice. The cold pressed in harder as the afternoon waned, and every gust of wind brought with it a whisper of doubt. Halfway home, Eloise nearly buckled. She paused, breathing hard, snow caking her lashes. She looked back at the man, his breath now visible, slow but steady. "What if he dies anyway?" she whispered, mostly to herself. Julia didn't answer, but her little hands found the rope and helped pull. By the time they reached the homestead, the light was bruising toward dusk. The cabin sat quiet in its ring of snow, smoke trailing weakly from the chimney. Inside it was barely warm. The fire had gone to coals in their absence. Eloise opened the door and pulled the man inside, dragging him across the floor onto a pallet by the hearth. Julia added kindling, coaxing flame with practiced care. Within minutes, heat began to curl back into the air. Eloise worked swiftly, cutting away the man's coat, checking his wounds, cleaning his temple with a strip of boiled linen. She spoke only once to herself. This was done with hate. Julia brought a pot of broth to the fire. The smell of it filled the space like hope. The man did not wake. That night, snow whispered against the windows, and the fire popped and hissed. Eloise sat beside the stranger, a bowl of broth cooling in her lap. She stared at his face, trying to place it. He looked like no one she'd known, too fine-featured to be a trapper, too lean to be a farmer. A man of money, yes. But who? And why left to die? She could not ask. Not yet. Julia curled up near the fire with the old quilt, her thumb brushing the corner, a habit from when she was smaller. Eloise hadn't seen it in months. Maybe something about the stranger brought the girl's childhood back for a moment. In the stillness, Eloise allowed herself a small wonder. Had this man been someone else's miracle before? A husband? A father? Had someone once waited for him the way she used to wait, for a knock that never came? She brushed a stray curl from his forehead. "You're not mine," she murmured, "but you're breathing. That'll have to be enough." The hours stretched. The wind howled. But he lived. And somewhere in the dark, a thread began to pull, quiet as snowfall, sure as fate. Something had shifted. Not loudly, not with thunder, just a tremor in the bones of winter. A story unfolding, breath by breath. Outside, the snow kept falling. But inside, a stranger lay warm by firelight, and a woman who'd given up on rescue sat guard, not knowing yet that saving him would save her too. Not knowing that empires don't always rise with war drums. Sometimes they begin with a rope cut loose, a bowl of broth, and a hand that didn't let go. The man slept for nearly 2 days, drifting in and out of consciousness like a boat adrift on a fogged lake. Fever flushed his face, then drained it, leaving only hollows and shallow breaths. Eloise sat beside him through the nights, spooning broth between his lips when he could take it, pressing cool cloths to his head when his skin burned. She said little, only what was needed, her words careful, like stones placed across a creek. Julia watched, wide-eyed but quiet, always watching her mother's hands, as if trying to learn not just what to do, but how to care. When the man finally stirred enough to open his eyes, the room was filled with low golden light. The stove crackled with steady flame, and snow continued to pile against the windowsill. He blinked, confused, gaze unfocused. "You're safe," Eloise said, not rising from her chair. Her voice was soft but unmistakably firm. "You're in my home." He blinked again, tried to speak, and found only a croak. Julia brought a tin cup of water and held it while he drank. His fingers were swollen and stiff, but he managed to grasp the edge. When he looked at her, there was gratitude in his eyes, but no smile. Not yet. He wasn't sure if he still remembered how. He fell asleep again before a full sentence could be formed. By the second evening, he stayed awake longer. He watched the flicker of the fire as Eloise stirred a pot. She wore an apron streaked with ash, her sleeves rolled to the elbows, her hair twisted back with a strip of linen. Not beautiful, not in the way people often meant it. But she moved with purpose, and that had its own kind of light. "Name's Garrett," he rasped. Eloise glanced at him, but didn't pause her stirring. "Eloise." He waited a beat, then nodded. His gaze drifted to Julia, who sat on the floor threading beads onto a strip of rawhide. "She yours?" he asked, voice still rasped from cold and disuse. Eloise looked over at the girl, her eyes softening in a way that gave her face back its warmth. "She is." There was a long silence after that. Not awkward, only careful. Neither of them knew what would be asked of the other, so both measured their presence like precious salt. In the mornings, Garrett sat propped against the wall while Eloise went about her tasks. He watched her mend a pair of socks, press herbs into a muslin pouch, scrape ashes from a stove. He noticed how she worked in silence, not as one who feared words, but as one who no longer found them necessary. Her care was in her doing, and it said enough. Julia grew more curious by the day. She'd sit near him now, sometimes reading aloud from the single book they owned. A Bible worn, so thin its pages felt like old petals. She didn't ask who he was or why he'd been left to die. Children sense the weight of a question before they lift it. One afternoon, as the snow softened to a fine drift outside, Garrett tried to stand. His legs buckled, and he collapsed with a grunt against the wall. Eloise crossed the room quickly, kneeling beside him before he could try again. Her hand steadied him at the shoulder, firm but gentle. "You'll tear open what's healing if you push," she said. "I don't like lying still," he muttered. "I don't like digging graves." Her words weren't cruel, only true. He eased back onto the mat. "You always this warm to strangers." "I didn't do it for you," she said simply. "My daughter saw you first." There was no boast in it, no need for gratitude. Just fact. Garrett looked toward Julia, who now traced figures on the frosted window with one finger, her breath fogging glass. "She saved me then." She did. That night, the fire glowed deep into the walls, casting long shadows that danced without sound. Garrett shifted beneath the quilt, not from pain, but from thought. "I was on my way back from Salt Creek," he said finally, not expecting a reply. "Had business there. Cattle contracts. Got jumped in the pines. Don't know if they meant to kill me or just rob me blind and let the cold do the rest." Eloise said nothing, just fed another log to the fire. "They were hired," he added, as if trying to explain. "Not the kind that steals for hunger. They were after something." Still, she said nothing, only listened. "I've land," he continued, "not far from here. East Ridge. 800 acres, and a house built wider than it needed to be. Thought it meant something, once. But all it did was make me a target." Eloise finally looked up. Men kill for smaller things. His laugh was brief and rough. "That they do." He did not speak again for some time. When he slept, it was deeper. Not from weakness now, but from trust. The next morning, Garrett tried to rise again. This time, Eloise led him. His steps were slow, leaning on a cane Julia had carved from a branch. He walked to the door and stood, looking out at the world beyond the cabin. White, wide, and waiting. Eloise came up beside him, arms folded. "You think they're still looking for you?" "Likely not," he said. "They got what they came for. Or think they did. And if they come again?" He looked at her. "Then I reckon I'll have to stop being a man who just survives." She studied him a moment, then nodded. "We survive here too." Garrett turned back to the view. "You do more than that." The days stretched longer as the snow eased its hold. The thaw was slow but sure, dripping from the eaves in rhythm with the fire's crackle inside. Garrett began helping where he could, splitting kindling, patching the broken fence near the coop. His shoulders still ached, but he moved with growing confidence. He didn't speak often of his past, and Eloise didn't pry. But in small details it unfolded. The way he moved carefully around tools, as if used to finer things. The way he corrected Julia's math gently, like someone who'd once managed men and numbers. The way he sat by the fire and watched them, not with hunger, but with something harder to name. Longing, perhaps. Or envy. One evening, Garrett knelt beside Julia, watching her tie knots in a line of string. She was building a trap for rabbits, something she'd learned from an old neighbor long gone. "You're clever," he said. She looked up, face solemn. "Mama taught me. We had to be." He nodded. "And brave, too." Julia didn't reply, but something in her chest rose taller. Later, Eloise stood at the stove, spoon in hand, tasting stew. Garrett watched her, hands tucked in his pockets. "You don't ask questions," he said quietly. "I ask the ones that matter." "What matters to you?" She met his gaze across the space between them. "That my daughter's safe. That no one brings ruin to this house. That the quiet we earned isn't broken." He took a slow breath. "I mean to leave soon. I'll have to reclaim what's mine. Put things in order." She nodded. "I expected as much. But I won't forget this." Eloise didn't smile, but something behind her eyes flickered. A warmth not yet open, but no longer closed. Garrett stepped forward, unsure of his own movement. He held out his hand, not for shaking, Just an offering, open-palmed. Eloise looked at it, then at him. Slowly, she placed her hand in his. It stayed there, a moment too long to be casual. "You saved me," he said. She shook her head. "You're still saving yourself." Outside, snow began to fall again. Light, drifting, almost too fine to see. But inside, something was melting. And neither of them turned away from the thaw. The days softened. Snow still dressed the trees, but the cold had changed. Not as cruel, not as sharp. The wind carried less bitterness. It no longer whispered warnings, but watched from the edges, waiting. The land, like a held breath, began to exhale. Garrett no longer slept near the hearth. He moved into the side room, the one Eloise had cleared after her husband left. She hadn't opened it in years. Dust and silence had lived there longer than any man. But now, a stranger's coat hung from a hook. His boots stood neatly by the door, and the room remembered warmth. In the light of late winter, the three of them became something like a rhythm. Garrett rose early and helped split wood with arms still healing, his left shoulder favoring him only slightly now. Julia fed the hens, scattered seed along the frozen ground, checked traps along the woods. Eloise baked bread more often than usual. She told herself it was to keep the house warm. They moved around each other not as guests or hosts, but as a trio built from necessity. Still, something else had taken root, tentative, unsaid, but real. There were glances held a moment longer, silences that felt fuller than noise. Each day stitched itself into something larger, a quilt of moments neither had meant to sew. Garrett had taken to fixing things. Not just the obvious repairs, a broken latch, a loose step, but the quiet, invisible sort of mending. He oiled the hinges that had grown for years. He rewired the stovepipe so smoke no longer curled in corners. He didn't ask permission, and Eloise never told him to stop. She watched him instead, often from the doorway, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. He noticed, always, but he never turned to look. One morning he brought in a carved piece of wood, a small horse, its shape rough but endearing. He set it beside Julia's bed while she was out. That evening, when she returned from the creek with wet mittens and a proud smile, she found it waiting. "You make this?" she asked. He nodded, brushing sawdust from his sleeves. Julia held the figure close, running a thumb along the imperfect legs. "It's lopsided." Garrett grinned. "So am I." Julia's laughter cracked the room open. Eloise, standing by the stove, turned her head and smiled. A real smile, soft and surprised at itself. Later, while Garrett washed his hands at the basin, Eloise stood beside him. "She's taken to you," she said. "I've taken to her," he replied without pause. "Both of you." She didn't answer, but her breath caught just a little, and he heard it. As the thaw pressed on, the forest changed. Icicles fell like broken glass from the eaves. Patches of earth, brown and brave, peeked through the white. The air carried birdsong again, faint and fleeting. Garrett walked the trail behind the house now, testing his strength. Eloise followed once, watching from a distance as he bent to touch the ground, as if reacquainting himself with the land. "You ever think about staying?" she asked one evening, voice barely above the fire's crackle. He looked up from the knife he was sharpening. "I think about it every day," he said. Eloise's hand stilled. She folded the fabric in her lap twice before setting it down. "You've got a ranch, land, people likely waiting on you." He nodded slowly. "I've got things that need reclaiming, but none that feel like home." She didn't meet his gaze. "This isn't a home. It's a shelter." "It's both," he said, "because of how you keep it." She rose then, not to flee, but to steady herself. She crossed the room and began to sweep, though there was little dirt. Garrett watched her, saw the effort it took not to speak. So he didn't push. He waited. That night, when the fire dimmed and Julia slept with the carved horse in her arms, Eloise lingered near the hearth. "You remind me of someone," she said suddenly. Garrett turned. "Your husband." "No," she said. "My father. He used to fix things even when they weren't broken." Garrett tilted his head. "And that was a kindness. It was how he stayed needed. He couldn't say he loved us, not out loud. But he mended gates like they were lifelines. Garrett nodded. I understand that. She looked at him, her gaze softening. I think you do. Another day passed. Then another. The bond between them was not quick nor easy. It wasn't sweet. It was sturdy. It didn't bloom. It grew quietly, like moss on stone. Julia noticed, before either adult would name it. She stood on the porch one evening, watching the two of them carry water back from the well. Their steps matched, their silhouettes casting one long shadow on the ground. You walk like you belong together, she said when Eloise joined her inside. Eloise paused in the doorway, the pail heavy in her hand. Don't speak like that, she said gently. It's not our place to hope for more than the moment gives. Julia tilted her head. But he gives you more moments. And he did. Garrett began drawing maps. On the corner of a table, he'd spread scraps of paper, charcoal sketches of the land he'd lost. He explained the slope of the valley, the creek that ran along its edge, the corral near the northern rise. Julia leaned in with curiosity. Eloise listened while pretending not to. There's a house there, he said once. Built it with my own hands. Big porch. Room enough for 3, maybe 4. Eloise turned from the stove, cautious. You think you'll get it back? I don't plan to ask, he said. I plan to take it. And if the men who tried to kill you are still there, then I'll be what they didn't expect, alive. She said nothing, only stared at the map, at the words he hadn't spoken. The next morning, Garrett saddled the old mule that had belonged to Eloise's husband. The animal was stubborn, half lame, but strong where it counted. Garrett packed only what he needed, his knife, some bread, a flask of creek water, and the map rolled tight and tucked into his coat. I'll be gone 3 days, he told them. Maybe 4. No more. Julia hugged him without waiting for permission. She'd grown bolder. Garrett knelt, held her back just as tightly. Be careful, she whispered. Eloise stood by the fence, arms folded, her mouth pressed thin. Garrett met her eyes. I'll come back. Men say that all the time, she said. I'm not most men. No, she admitted. You're not. He turned to go, then stopped. Stepped back once, twice. Then he reached forward, took her hand, calloused, dry, strong, and lifted it to his lips. He didn't kiss it like a gentleman. He pressed it like a prayer. She let him. And then he was gone. The days stretched long in his absence. The cabin felt both smaller and emptier. Julia tried to stay busy, but she watched the window more often than usual. Eloise chopped wood that didn't need chopping, scrubbed pans twice, sat outside in the cold even when there was no sun to catch. The nights were harder. She didn't say it aloud, but Julia noticed, the way her mother left the lamp burning just a little longer, the way she walked past his room and lingered in the doorway before turning away. On the 4th day, no rider came. On the 5th, still nothing. Eloise began to ration worry, like flour. Not too much at once, but enough to keep herself prepared. By the 6th evening, the wind rose again. This time, it carried something different. Not snow, but hoofbeats. Julia ran to the window first. Mama. Eloise didn't rush. She walked to the door slowly, stepped out onto the porch with arms steady and jaw set. Garrett rode into the clearing just as dusk turned the snow violet. He was bruised, bloodied at the brow, but upright. Behind him trailed a second horse, saddlebags full. He dismounted with a wince, favoring his side. Julia ran first, barreling into him with all the weight a small girl could carry. He caught her, lifted her with one arm, and held her close. Eloise didn't move from the porch. Garrett set Julia down, then met Eloise's gaze across the yard. It's done, he said. They're gone. She narrowed her eyes. You're sure? He nodded. I took back the land. Every board of it. They didn't expect me to be stubborn, or angry, or lucky. She crossed the yard now, stopping in front of him. You're bleeding. I've bled worse. You shouldn't have gone alone. I didn't want to bring trouble here, but I thought of you every mile. They stood that way for a long moment, snow starting to fall again, quiet and clean. You've got your empire back, she said. I don't want it without you in it. She looked past him, toward the woods, then back at the cabin. Finally, her eyes returned to his. "We're not built for big houses," she said. "I don't need a big house. I need a kitchen that smells like you, and a little girl drawing horses on the porch. And me." He stepped closer. "You're the heart of all of it." She reached up, touched the cut on his cheek. He winced, but didn't pull away. "You'll stay. If you'll have me." "I'll think about it," she said, but her hand didn't leave his face. Inside, Julia had already placed the wooden horse at the center of a table, as if saving a place. Garrett turned to look at the house, then back to Eloise. "Spring's coming," he said. "Not yet," she replied. "No," he agreed, brushing snow from her sleeve, "but it's close." And though nothing more was spoken, something settled between them. Sure as roots under thawing soil, quiet but ready. Things had begun to grow, things not easily shaken. And somewhere in the snow-laced dusk, love began, not with fire, but with something sturdier. A promise without words. A home remade. The wind returned with teeth. Not the soft winds of early thaw, but a dry, bitter one that scoured the land like a warning. It came down from the north, harsh and full of memory, stirring the ash in the hearth and setting loose boards to moaning. Eloise stood at the window that morning, eyes narrowed toward the distant ridge where the sky met the pines. Something in her chest tightened. Garrett had been gone 3 weeks. He wrote once, a short letter left with a trapper passing through. It said the house was nearly ready. The fences stood straight again, and the land was his by right once more. He asked them to come soon. Promise safety. Promise spring. But spring had not yet come, and the silence in the trees had teeth of its own. Eloise did not speak of her worry. She moved through her days with practiced steadiness, baking, sewing, tending to the chickens, as if routine could muffle the rustle in her gut. Julia noticed, of course. Children always do. She asked fewer questions now, but lingered nearer than before, brushing against her mother's side when passing, speaking in softer tones, eyes too old for her face. On the 4th Sunday, Eloise packed a satchel. Not much, dried meat, matches, the pistol Garrett had left behind. She checked the saddle on the mule twice, tightening the girth with a precision born from caution. "You're going after him," Julia said, not asking, just stating. Eloise didn't pause. He said he'd send word. He hasn't. "I'm coming." "No, you're not." Julia stepped forward, fists at her sides. "If you don't come back, I'll be alone." "You won't be," Eloise said gently. "You've got the neighbors close, and Mrs. Abel's just 2 fields over. I'll be gone no more than 2 days." "But what if?" Eloise knelt then, took Julia's face in her hands. "We are not built for fear, my girl. We were forged in it. That's different. That means we walk through it and still keep going." Julia didn't cry, but her lip trembled. Eloise kissed her brow. "If I'm not back by the 3rd day, you go to Mrs. Abel. Tell her I said to open the root cellar and wait." Julia nodded. Eloise mounted and turned the mule east, toward the ranch Garrett had claimed again, the place of wide porches and unfinished promises. The land was quieter than she expected. No deer along the creek, no hawks circling. Just the hum of cold wind and the crunch of hooves over old frost. She traveled until dusk, then made a small camp beside a leaning pine. She lit no fire, wrapped herself tight, and slept with the pistol close. She dreamed of smoke and footsteps, of doors opening and no one behind them. By noon the next day, she reached the edge of Garrett's land. It was vast, wide slopes of gray grass, still sleeping beneath the last of the frost, and a long line of fence posts stretching like ribs along the property line. She spotted the ranch house in the distance, a dark silhouette against the pale sky. It looked still, too still. Eloise dismounted and led the mule forward on foot, boots sinking into soft patches of thawed earth. The barn came first, doors slightly ajar, one hinge broken. Inside, tools lay scattered, as if dropped mid-use. A spade, a leather strap. No horses, no hay. The silence pressed tighter here, like a hand on her throat. She moved to the house, pistol drawn. The front door hung crooked on its hinge. She stepped through slowly, eyes sharp, every step measured. It wasn't empty. The kitchen bore signs of life, a pot half cleaned in the basin, boots by the back door. Dust hadn't settled. Someone had been here recently. She moved through each room, checking corners, hands steady despite the drumbeat in her chest. Then she saw the smear of blood on the floor near the hearth. Not old, not dry. She crouched, touched it. Still tacky. Then came the sound, the faintest shuffle above her. The stairs groaned under weight. Eloise stepped back into shadows, pistol raised, breath caught between silence and resolve. A figure appeared, tall, rough, face hidden by a wide hat. Not Garrett. This man carried himself differently. There was something twitchy in his movements, something used to hiding. She held her stance. "I'm looking for the man who owns this place," she said clearly. The man paused at the top of the stairs, hand on the rail. "Ain't here." "Where is he?" "Don't know. Maybe dead. Maybe gone. Ain't my concern." "Wrong," she said. The man took another step. "You his wife?" "No," she said. "But I'm the one he trusted." He hesitated, then smiled without warmth. "That a threat?" "It's a fact." The man tilted his head, studied her, then turned without another word and walked back upstairs. She heard the soft thump of a door closing. Eloise didn't wait. She moved quickly to the side room, the one Garrett had described once, said it had a trapdoor beneath the rug. She found it, lifted it. Beneath was a narrow crawl space, dry and dark. And Garrett, unconscious, bleeding from the shoulder, tied at the wrists, rope raw against the skin. She dropped to her knees, heart leaping, hands already working to cut him free. His eyes fluttered, opened halfway. "Ellie, don't speak. You came." "Of course I did." She freed his hands, then pressed her ear to his chest. Heartbeat sluggish, but steady. No smell of infection. Just exhaustion. Maybe fever. She helped him out slowly, inch by inch, every breath a wince. When he was finally upright, he leaned heavily against her. "3 of them," he whispered. "Wanted the land. Came back when I was fixing the fence. Thought I was alone. You fought. I lost." "Not for long," she said, voice steel. They moved through the house, slow and careful. Garrett leaned on her shoulder, and she guided him toward the back door. But as they stepped outside, the man from upstairs reappeared, rifle in hand. "Should have finished you myself," he spat. Eloise raised the pistol. "I don't miss," she said. He hesitated, gauging her, maybe testing the shake in her hand. There wasn't one. "You won't make it a mile," he warned. "Then I'll die trying." The man didn't shoot. He stood still, breathing heavy. Eloise stepped forward, just enough to shield Garrett. "You're not the first man to underestimate a woman with a gun and something to protect," she said, low and deadly. He flinched, just slightly, then slowly lowered the rifle. "You're not worth a shot," he muttered, and turned away. She didn't look back. They left the ranch at dusk, Garrett riding on the mule, Eloise leading it by hand. Each step back toward home was a promise that she would not let the dark win, not this time. They made camp beneath a cedar tree. She cleaned his wound by moonlight, hands tender despite the fire in her blood. He winced once, then held her wrist. "You're not just strong," he whispered. "You're unbreakable." "No," she said softly, brushing hair from his forehead. "I break. I just don't stay that way." He slept then, finally safe, beneath the stars. She sat awake beside him, pistol across her knees, eyes on the dark woods beyond. She didn't sleep, didn't need to. Not yet. By dawn, they reached the ridge. The sky broke open with light, not golden yet, but warming. Home wasn't far now. Julia would be waiting, she knew. The door open, the fire lit, the kettle already on. Garrett stirred behind her. "We made it," he murmured. "Yes," she said, though she didn't yet smile. "But it's not over." He nodded, voice hoarse. "Whatever comes next, I want to face it with you." And finally Eloise smiled, the kind that reached all the way into her eyes. "You already are." They crossed the last stretch of field together. One step, then another, into whatever came next. The danger had not vanished. The world was still wide and uncertain, but they were no longer alone. And sometimes that was enough to keep going. The sky over the frontier brightened slowly, like a curtain being pulled open on a stage that had long slept in shadow. Garrett sat on the porch steps, one arm in a sling, the other curled around a coffee cup Julia had brought him, her boots crunching faintly in the frost-kissed earth. Beside him, Eloise stood with her arms folded, a quiet shape in the morning light, watching the thin trail of smoke rise from the chimney and vanish into the pale blue. The house behind them, his house, now their house, had been scrubbed of blood, dust, and memory. It still creaked when the wind hit, just right. Still groaned beneath its bones. But now there were curtains at the windows, hand-sewn by Eloise, rough at the hem and perfect in their imperfection. A row of Julia's sketches, horses, birds, and odd creatures from her dreams, were tacked to the walls in the front room. In the weeks since they'd returned from the edge of death and fire, life had taken on a rhythm, not unlike the slow turn of the seasons, subtle but certain. Garrett walked with more strength each day, planting one foot after the other across land he'd nearly lost. Eloise tended the hens with quiet efficiency, her skirts tucked up, boots muddy by midday. Julia found endless wonder in the fields, chasing fox tracks and naming every star she could count come nightfall. It was not peace that had settled over them, not quite. Peace is what people speak of who've never bled for it. What they had was something more earned, an understanding, a truth between them that required no naming. The morning Garrett planted the first fence post of the new paddock, Eloise brought him water in a tin cup. He took it without words, his hand brushing hers, callous skin to callous skin. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For the water?" she asked. "For not letting me die." She didn't answer right away. She looked toward the fields where Julia was playing with the colt that had wandered from a neighbor's farm and never left. Then her eyes returned to him. "You gave us something too," she said. "We just didn't know it yet." "What did I give you?" he asked. She hesitated, but her voice was steady. "A place to belong without asking for permission." That afternoon, Garrett took Julia up to the northern ridge, the highest point on the land, where the wind blew clean and fast. From there, she could see all of it. The barn with its patched roof, the thin creek running silver through the grass, the line of cottonwoods just beginning to bud. "It's big," she whispered, awed. Garrett knelt beside her, wincing only slightly. "It's yours too, if you want it." She turned to him, brows lifted. "Mine. You and your mama. I didn't build this place to grow old and alone." She was quiet a moment. "What if you leave like my real pa did?" He looked at her then, eyes clear and solemn. "I've done a lot of running in my life, Julia. But I ran out of places that felt right. This one, your home, your mother, it's not something I'll walk away from. Not unless I'm carried." She nodded slowly, her face older than her years. "Okay." Then she leaned into him, sudden and fierce, and he let her. Arms wrapped around his neck, small body pressed close. That night, Eloise found them both asleep in the rocker on the porch, stars spilled across the sky like spilled salt, their faces peaceful in the pale moonlight. The weeks ripened into a kind of soft steadiness. Garrett had old friends ride in, quiet men with scarred hands and eyes that had seen too much. They came not for celebration, but for work. They helped mend the barn, clear the fallen timber along the southern fence, and dig the foundation for a smokehouse Eloise had long dreamed of building. At first, she stayed back, unsure what to make of these men. She watched them warily from the windows, her instincts trained to scan for threat even when kindness wore a familiar shape. But Garrett was careful. He always introduced her first, always spoke her name with a kind of reverence, as if she were something sacred. "This is Eloise," he told them, "and nothing that stands here stands without her." The men tipped their hats. One of them, a half-Cheyenne scout named Willard, gave her a polished stone from his pocket and said, "For luck." She took it with a nod, but later placed it on the kitchen windowsill where it caught the light, just right. Julia liked Willard best. He taught her to follow tracks and listen to the wind. He called her Little Flame and told her stories in the dusk when Garrett and Eloise sat close on the porch, fingers just barely touching. On the evening the smokehouse walls went up, Garrett took Eloise by the hand and led her around the house, down to the place where the creek curved like a question mark through the grass. The sun was low, gold and aching, The sky lit in bands of copper and rose. "I want to marry you," he said simply. She didn't look at him. She stared at the water, at the way it moved. Relentless, soft, powerful. "I don't need a ring," she replied. "I know. I don't need a preacher." "Neither do I." She turned then, slow, the wind teasing her hair loose. "But I need to know you won't turn away when the world leans hard again." "I can't promise the world won't try," he said, "but I'll stand between it and you every time." There was a stillness between them then. Not empty. Full. "You already do," she said. They didn't speak of vows again. They didn't have to. Instead, the next morning, Garrett dug a trench for roses outside the kitchen. Eloise laughed, called him a fool, and baked him a pie that afternoon without speaking of it. That night he built her a shelf above the bed and left 3 small things on it: a feather, the bead horse Julia had carved for him, and a folded piece of paper. She opened it when he was asleep beside her, the candle low. Inside, in his unsteady hand, were the words, "You are my beginning again." The summer brought heat and bees, and the soft bloom of wildflowers along the eastern edge. The land grew full, thick with promise. Their lives, once carved from desperation, now found rhythm in tenderness. There were still bad days. Eloise still woke sometimes from dreams of being alone. Garrett still flinched at shadows on the horizon. But they had each other now. And Julia. That was enough. Until the night the rider came. It was near midnight. A storm in the distance, flashing silent against the hills. Garrett was on the porch, sharpening a tool. Eloise dozed beside him, wrapped in a blanket. Julia was inside, curled around the cat they'd rescued from a barn loft. The hoofbeats came hard, fast, echoing off the dirt like thunder. Garrett stood, blade in hand. Eloise followed him to the edge of the porch. The rider pulled up short, breathless, his horse lathered with sweat. It was one of Garrett's men, face pale as milk. "They're coming," he gasped. 3 men, armed. "Said you took what was theirs." Garrett's jaw tightened. "How far behind?" "An hour, maybe less." Eloise turned, already moving toward the door. Julia. They made ready without panic. That was the gift of hardship. It taught you how to move without noise. Garrett loaded the rifle. Eloise tucked the pistol into her waistband. Julia helped carry blankets to the cellar, calm and quick-eyed. They didn't run. They waited. When the men came, they didn't sneak. They rode in loud, guns drawn, faces masked. Garrett stood in front of the porch, rifle steady, Eloise at his side. "This land is mine by right and blood," Garrett said. One of the men laughed. "You bled already, remember? And we came back to finish the job." Garrett didn't blink. "You're welcome to try." The first shot cracked like a whip. Eloise fired before the sound even faded. One man fell from his horse with a howl, leg torn through. The second raised his gun and caught a bullet square in the shoulder. Garrett shot. The third froze, hands raised, mouth open. Then he turned and fled, horse kicking mud behind him like smoke. It was over in seconds. Garrett exhaled. Eloise lowered her weapon. "You all right?" she asked. He nodded. "You." She smiled then. "I'm tired of being interrupted." He laughed, short and rough, and leaned into her just a little. Julia peeked from the cellar steps, eyes wide. "We're safe," Eloise said, reaching for her. "We're all right." Later that night, when the storm finally broke and the rain swept across the land, Garrett stood beneath it with arms open wide. Eloise came to him, barefoot, soaked through. "You could have died," she whispered against his chest. "So could you." "But we didn't," she said. "No," he replied. "We built something instead." They stood in the rain, wrapped in each other. And when the thunder passed and the sky cleared again, the stars returned, bright and unbroken. Their empire hadn't been forged in gold or conquest. It was made of bread shared, wounds tended, fences rebuilt, and hearts that chose to stay. A mother, a daughter, a man once left for dead. Together, they claimed the land not with weapons, but with tenderness. And as the dawn crept in, quiet, gentle, full of promise, the porch light flickered back to life. And love, steady and unshakable, reigned.